Dark Souls 2, everyone's favorite game. It has the second highest number of bosses after Elden Ring, and today we're gonna rank them all from easiest to hardest. I also added them to a tier list, and without further ado, let's get started. The easiest boss in Dark Souls 2 has to be Prowling Magus and Congregation, so let's see what this fight has in store for us. A wizard that dies in 6 hits, some zombies that don't even attack you, some crawling zombies that can't even get close to you, and 2 witches that do decent damage but shoot about once every 10 seconds. So pretty much the only way to die in this fight is if you have no healing going into it or you're extremely careless. F tier, it can barely even be considered a boss. Next up on the list we have Royal Rat Vanguard. This fight you just have to kill some rats until this big swag rat spawns and then you kill it in 7 hits. You can get overwhelmed by the rats if you completely ignore them until the swag rat spawns, but it shouldn't be too hard to get away from them and just heal if you're in a pinch. F tier, a bunch of rats in a room, yeah, great. Fun fight. Last Giant was the first boss I fought in this playthrough, and having about 60% of my already tiny max health was a hurdle, as I did die once, but he's slow and doesn't do much damage, so I can't really say that he's harder than any of the bosses later on in the list. E tier, he's just slow and boring looking with a boring moveset in a boring arena. Skeletal Lords. Now you might have noticed this game really likes its bosses that are just a bunch of enemies thrown into a room, and usually they're pretty boring as you just run around and kill them one by one. And these fights might start hard like this one, but as you kill more and more enemies the fight gets easier. This fight does have the skeleton wheels from Dark Souls 1, but they're not nearly as strong. If they were as strong as the ones in Dark Souls 1, this fight would be top 3 hardest fights in the game. But thankfully, they're pretty shit. They also have some magic wizards in the arena, but they're not really that threatening. F tier, I don't think I need to elaborate on this decision. Covetous Demon is kind of like old King Allant from Demon Souls. He kind of just flops around and doesn't really hit you, but if you're careless and he does manage to hit you, he does a lot of damage. But he's so easy to evade or just stay behind as his health is low, so I feel like he deserves this spot. F tier, what can I say? This is Jabba the Hutt. I don't like when bosses just flop around and knock you over, dealing half of your health in one hit. Old Dragon Slayer can be fought as the first boss in the game, and sure, he might be hard if you do that, but if you fight him around mid-game like I did, then he's very easy. His attacks are super easy to dodge, and he doesn't really do a lot of damage, and he is nothing compared to his Dark Souls 1 counterpart, C tier. It's just not the same. Dragon Rider is a perfect example of why ranking Dark Souls 2 bosses is hard. His arena is small, so you can fall off at any time, and his attacks cover more than like half the arena, making the fight fairly hard. But if you pull a hidden lever outside the arena, the holes get covered and he's suddenly about 4 times easier. So I'll just put him right here since his health is fairly high for the early game. C tier, it's fun enough, but it's really nothing special. Mytha, the Baneful Queen, might be hard with the poison in her room, but I've never fought her like that, so she's going down here on my list. Her health is low, she's easy to dodge, and she doesn't do much damage. You could probably say that about most of the bosses down here, to be fair. C tier, I like the design, but the fight could have been a lot better if she had more health and a more fun moveset. Twin Dragon Riders is just a Dragon Rider fight, but there's an extra one with a bow that has about half the original's health. If you don't know how to get the archer down to kill it first, then the fight might be a bit harder, but it's really not much harder than the OG, especially since you're such a higher level at this point in the game, and even the arena is a lot easier. Maybe I should have put him lower than the OG, but I'm gonna stay with my gut. D tier, it's a reskin gank, I'm not a fan. Royal Rat Authority is just safe, but so much worse. Bunch of rats that give you toxic if you're not careful, and then a big dog that's not really hard unless you have set toxic effect on you. And also be careful of his vomit, it does way more damage than expected. His attacks aren't that dangerous, and getting a healing option is super easy. D tier, it's just a somehow jankier version of safe with toxic rats in the room and no lore that I know of, at least. The Rotten is slow, but he has a lot of health and does a lot of damage. And of course he has an explosion attack that has a very short windup. He can knock you into the fire in this arena, which can hurt a lot, but unless you go far in, you probably won't die. D tier, I really don't like bosses like this that have a very high HP and damage but are super slow. Old Iron King, I originally had this guy higher, but after watching the fight again, I realized how insanely slow he is. He slams his hand to the ground super slowly and then it just stays there. and you can hit it like 6 times. His fire breath attacks are also easy to just run away from, and overall his damage isn't high either. D tier, slow and boring, but his arena looks cool I guess, even though it's small and annoying. Giant Lord is like the last giant, but on steroids with a big ass sword. He's solo, but I swear evading his sword is so awkward. He does quite a bit of damage, but you can use 2 life gems in between each attack, so unless he gets a lucky combo on you or does his slam, you won't really die. D tier, he's so big that you can barely even see what he's doing half the time, which is just annoying. Aldia, Scholar of the First Sin, might just be the slowest boss in the entire franchise. He does 1 attack every 20 seconds, and while they might do a lot of damage, they're really easy to avoid. You can't hit him 90% of the time because of some wall of fire, which is annoying, but it does make him like 20% harder, so fair play I guess. F tier, very disappointing final fight. Duke's dear Freya and her children are fairly difficult, but as with most bosses in this game, she only attacks once every 10 seconds, so life gems make the fight trivial. Her Iron Man laser beam attack is pretty hard to evade for the first few times, but once you know what to do, it's pretty easy to evade. Her mouth grabs are probably her most difficult attack, as that's where you're standing if you're trying to hit her. D tier, it's a big ass spider, she's not getting anything above a D tier. I am excited to see her in Light Rain though. Elana is like a mix between Astrea, Nito, and Gwendolyn, and who could have guessed, this fight fucking sucks. She summons Garl Velstadt and some annoying skeletons, and her magic is unpredictable. If you get hit by magic and a summon at the same time, you can easily get one shot. E tier, fighting summons while trying to evade magic is just not fun at all, especially when the summons are boring or old reskinned bosses. The Pursuer, now this fight can be made a lot easier by using the crossbows in his arena. They do about 80% of his health, but it is fairly hard to set up a shot. He has quite a lot of health for the early game, but he's not too hard to dodge, and his damage is fairly minimal. C tier, I don't like that he's reused 15 times throughout the game when he randomly pops up, and his fight is decent, but lacks some spice, you know. Scorpioness Najika is fast and has a very varied moveset for this game, with some magic to top it off. She would be a lot higher on the difficulty list if she did more damage, but I'm glad she doesn't do a lot because I'm very sick of randomly getting one shot in this game. B tier, like I said, she has a varied moveset which is super rare in this game, so I enjoy the fight, and she looks pretty cool too. Looking Glass Knight is tanky but doesn't do much damage. His summon is soft but does a decent amount of damage. It's overall a pretty well balanced fight, even though it is a bit too easy. His lightning attacks look sick as fuck, but they're pretty easy to dodge. B tier, he looks very cool and the rain makes a great atmosphere, but he's just a bit too easy. Guardian Dragon is one of the easier dragon fights in this series, mostly just because his fire attacks are pretty inaccurate and easy to just run away from, and he barely does any attacks when he's on the ground. He just stomps and you can easily avoid them. His health isn't much either for this point in the game, so he dies in like 2 minutes. D tier, pretty meh dragon fight, but it could always get worse, you know. The Lost Sinner is a pretty fast-paced fight for this game, which automatically makes it fairly hard. Her swings are so wide that it feels like she could hit you while she's facing the other way. Getting a heal off against her is also fairly hard, as she likes to rush you as soon as you use a life gem, and with how early this fight is, you usually won't have enough ADP for good iframes, which just makes it even harder. B tier, I enjoy the pace of this fight and it gives a solid challenge, I just don't like the camera in it. Nashandra would be in the top 10 if Curse in this game worked like Dark Souls 1, but thankfully Curse in this game does basically nothing. Her swings are easy enough to get caught by and do quite a bit of damage. Her lasers are pretty easy to evade, but of course she has an explosion to make up for it. D tier, she's just not that fun of a fight, and with her being the final boss for most players, it's a big disappointment. Smelter Demon has a lot of health and some mean combos, but his damage is pretty whack. His second and third phase don't really make him all that much harder, and compared to his Smurf counterpart, he's a piece of cake. B tier, he's fun, but nothing really special. Executioner's Chariot starts off with a puzzle that's very simple if you know what to do. Then you fight the horse, which is a pretty simple fight, but he does do a fair amount of damage. He has some magic that homes onto you, and his kick has a strange hitbox, so he can be scary. C tier, it's a cool looking horse, and the racetrack gimmick is fun enough. Demon of Song is very unassuming, but this motherfucker can just one-shot you at any time. If you just run away as he's doing his attacks and then run to him when he's idle, you can beat him pretty easily, but it might take a while. If you fight him like a man and stay up close the entire time, you're very likely to get one-shot by one of his attacks. D tier, he does have a funny alternate name, and he looks pretty freaky, but as a fight, it's not good. Grave Robber Trio is mostly just running around until you can separate one of them and kill them one at a time. I put it this high because it's fairly easy to mess up, especially if you get greedy, and it's one of those fights where it's hard until you kill one of them and then it just gets easier and easier. E tier, it should be known by now that I don't like gank fights, and this is like triple gank with boring NPCs, so yeah. Burnt Ivory King. Just to be clear, I'm only including the fight with the king himself and not the battle leading up to it. However, he does sometimes have an extra soldier with him, which I will count. If he does have a soldier with him and all of yours are dead, then it can be a troublesome gank fight, but if you fight him one-on-one, it's one of the best and fairest fights in the game. His health is decent, but his damage is fairly low, but he kinda makes up for it by having some pretty long combos and a short downtime. He's probably the closest thing we have to an Elden Ring fight in this game. He even does a sick back cartwheel thing to get away from you. B tier, he has one of the coolest areas, not just in this game, but in the entire franchise, and your entry into his arena is also super sick. Also one of the best paced fights in the game. Would have been A tier if you didn't have to do the preliminary fight after every attempt. Throne Watchers, a gank fight with two aggressive people, both of which have shields, and both of which can turn their swords into Walmart lightsabers. You go for the old guy, and then the girl jumps you, then you try attacking her, and she does some crazy acrobatics to run away from you. So you get like 2 or 3 hits every 10 seconds. Thankfully their damage is fairly minimal. C tier, it's good for a gank fight, but it's still a gank fight. Velstadt is an absolute unit. He has a lot of health and even got extra defense during his second phase, so I did like half of my normal damage to him. And then he himself does a fairly high amount of damage to you. His attacks have a wide range and he gains magic in his second phase that can one-shot you or do like 90% of your health. B tier, this guy looks really cool and his attacks are pretty fun to dodge. Flexile Sentry was one of the first bosses I fought in this playthrough, and boy was that a mistake. My adaptability was super low, so I felt like I couldn't even roll through their attacks. And then the water in the room rises, so your rolls are even more shit, and then you have like no life gems because it's so early on in the game, and then their attacks do like almost half your health and you do minimal damage. That being said, B tier. This fight is really fun. I love the concept of it, and the water adds a fun twist, even if it is annoying at times. And they have some really sick moves. Ruin Sentinels is another fight that's mostly hard because of how early it is. Each of their attacks did more than half of my HP, and if I was low and tried escaping by jumping down from the platform, I just died. And that's not even counting the times I accidentally jumped off the platform. They have some crazy spin attack that is hard to dodge, but as you never really fight all of them at the same time, it's a bit more manageable. D tier, trio gank, there's just 3 of the same dudes that don't even have varied weapons or cool black hoods, so yeah, it's gonna be enough for me. Belfry Gargoyles, this fight was absolute hell. The Dark Souls 1 fight is already hard enough to find an opening, and this one you're fighting 3 to 4 at a time, and they might be even more aggressive than their Dark Souls 1 counterpart. Then they add a lightning attack in the later half of the fight, and did I mention you fight 6 of them in total, and this is in the first 6th of the game, so you're fairly under level. D tier, this fight is really just a running simulator, similar to the Grave Robber trio. Vendrick has an insane amount of health and defense, and his damage is absolutely insane. As an endgame boss, each of his hits did like 70 to 80% of my health in one hit. If I try to get some distance from him to heal, he just run towards me while I was healing and kill me. And he had a double sweep attack where if you got hit once, you get stunned into being hit by the next one, so that was an insta-kill. F tier, I hate these kinds of fights where it's a damage sponge with insane damage. Ava's challenge really just comes from how quick she is at closing distances. There were points where I was like 15 meters away and just wanted to heal, and within a second Ava had closed the gap and I was suddenly stuck in her mouth. She also has magic, but it's very manageable. She also has a pretty high amount of health and her skin breaks your sword really fast, so actually I had to use my left hand weapon for once. D tier, I don't really like any of her attacks, and the design is just a big tiger. I feel like they could have done more with it. Ancient Dragon, low-key might be the worst fight in the entire series. He has an insane amount of health, and his jump fire breathing attack does more than half your damage and knocks you over, so if you don't manage to run far enough away, it will one-shot you. And the best part is, if you don't start running the second you've seen a sign of him doing that attack, you are most likely dead. His other attacks are fine, but the fact that you need to survive his jump fire breath attack like more than 10 times before you do enough damage to kill him is absolutely absurd. F tier, as I said with Vendrick, I hate bosses like these where they have infinite health and can 1 or 2 shot you at any time. On to the best dragon fight in this game, we have Sin the Slumbering Dragon. His health and damage are both high, but not high enough that it's unfair, and he has a varied moveset. He can induce toxin in you, which does a lot of damage, but it doesn't last for too long. His moves are fairly learnable, but they're very hard as you're starting out. B tier, he has a very cool design. I just wish the graphics in this game were better. The green and gray aesthetic is great. I have one gripe with him, and that's how much actually flies away from you at times. Alod and Salon. Let's just start with this. F tier. Why in the fuck did they decide to make one of the hardest bosses in the game have the frigid outskirts as the run back? A lot is easy enough as it's just like fighting Ava again, but then when he's half health, Salon joins in. And remember what I said about Ava? Really fast at closing distances. So fighting two of those fuckers at the same time is absolutely horrendous. And they also have the magic Ava hat, and now you need to worry about that too, even if you manage to separate them. And when you finally manage to kill Lud, you're on a roll, doing pretty good, and he gets Salon to like a fifth of his health. You think, oh my god, it's gonna be over soon, and bam, he enters a second phase where you do less damage to him, and he already had a decent amount of health. And on top of that, he starts regenerating his health back. So yeah, fuck this fight, never doing it again. Frigid Outskirts would already be number one if it was a boss fight, and then you have to do this right after. Fuck this game. Alright, now we're on to the big boys, Fume Knight. He's honestly pretty slow, but sometimes he's so slow that it actually makes the fight harder. And he has some fast gap closing attacks that make it hard to heal, and some of his combos are very fast. And he's pretty similar to a lot of other bosses from other games, so he's not super hard to learn. A tier, he's just a fun challenge, and thankfully his run back is very short. Sir Alon is very fast, and because he's so fast, it's like almost impossible to get a heal off. And on top of that, there isn't really another boss like him in the Souls franchise, so he's very hard to get used to. But really, most of the difficulty comes from the fact that you can't really heal. A tier, the fight just fits so well in the Dark Souls 2 engine, so I have to say this is my favorite boss in the game. It's definitely the fastest fight in the game, and it feels very honorable, and it would be very fun to do hitless. Blue Smelter Demon is just Smelter Demon reskinned blue for the DLC, but he has way more health and damage, and the attacks are more delayed than Attack on Titan's ending. I feel like I could kill the first Smelter Demon in the time he's winding some of his attacks up. Not to mention, he has one of the worst runbacks in the entire series, which it has in common with number one on the list, so maybe that's saying something, I don't know. C tier, it's a reskin with about 2 times as much damage, 3 times as much health, and 4 times as much delay. And finally, at number 1, we have Dark Lurkers. Now, this fight is probably way harder because of the stress it induced in me. First, you need to finish the 3 challenges that were hard as shit and cost a human effigy for every attempt. And then you need to finish the challenges again for every attempt you want to do on the boss, and that costs a human effigy too. I'd go as far as to say that the first phase is easy, since most of the attacks have long build-ups and aren't too hard to dodge, but once you add another one and you have to focus on 2 of them at the same time, while they can be very separated and hard to look at both of them, it gets borderline impossible with most attacks being ranged, doing 2 or 3/5 of your health. So if they decide to both do the magic missile attack at the same time and you can't dodge it, you're just dead. B tier, it could have been higher if the damage wasn't fucking insane and if you didn't have to spin an effigy for each attempt. Alright, thanks for making it to the end. Comment down below what you think is the hardest boss in the game. I could see any of the ones in the top 5 being the hardest, so I'm very curious to see what others think. Next week, we start Bloodborne. Well, I've already finished editing the entire game, but making this video took forever. So next week, we start Dark Souls 3. But that's getting uploaded in like 3 weeks, 4 weeks, I don't know, hopefully.